As we see U.S. policymakers trying to figure out how to respond to the turmoil we've seen in the past weeks, the stock market plummeting, the downgrade of the U.S. credit rating by Standard & Poor's, we can look back on history for a lesson still being felt today. 40 years ago to this day, President Nixon faced inflation, staggering war costs, which had caused an increase in money printing and a decrease in the value of the dollar. Also joblessness. Now, he was 15 months away from re-election. Ring a bell? Well, that's about where President Barack Obama is right now. And he gave the country the Nixon shock in response to what he faced. He ended the last remnants of the gold standard, making it so dollars couldn't be converted to gold. He rationalized it then this way.
In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators.
All right, he said it was defending the dollar. Critics argue it was one of the most important decisions in modern economic history for a different reason, that it cost the long-term economy substantially. Now, what's happened to the value of the dollar since? Well, let's take a look. The dollar has lost 98% of its value since going off of that peg to gold. Take a look at that, plunging the dollar bill, and that red line going up. That's how the money supply has increased, the amount of money in the economy. Money printing, what some might call that. Now, what has happened to gold at the same time? That price has skyrocketed. We've seen gold hit record highs of $1,800 an ounce just last week. Right now, it's around $1,746 the last time I checked. Remember, during the Bretton Woods days, it was pegged to $35 an ounce. The dollar was pegged to it. That was the price. Now it has gone up exponentially. So what does this all say? And where should this all lead? Joining us for more now is Lew Rockwell. He is chairman of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Thanks for being here. Now, Nixon back then said that this decision was about protecting the dollar as a pillar of financial stability around the world. Was it, or did it set the stages for exactly the opposite, including the 3 decades of boom and bust we saw since then?
Well, there's a reason that Nixon was known as Tricky Dick. And of course, he was lying when he said all those things. I remember that speech. And he also imposed price and wage controls in the manner of a dictator. But it was a terrible thing. Again, he also took the dollar off the remnants of the gold standard by just executive fiat, just his own say-so. It was a terrible thing. What this inaugurated was, for the first time in the history of the world, money that was purely discretionary, that is, money that could be printed up by the central bank, in our case, the Federal Reserve, just ad infinitum. So that is exactly what's happened. And that's what Richard Nixon intended. He wanted a lot of inflation to re-elect himself. He thought it would be good. He wanted to disguise that inflation by putting price and wage controls on. But what he did was he's brought about the death of the dollar. We should all remember Nixon for this. He did a lot of evil things in his life, Richard Nixon. But you're right, this is probably his most long-lasting, terrible thing he did. And we're now suffering from it, and the whole world is suffering from it, because all the other countries that are allied with the U.S. went on a similar paper money standard, with even Switzerland, with no restriction on the central bank. It's brought, exactly as you say, booms and busts, and a general decline in, by the way, the standard of living of the average American is lower today. Lower.
Right. If I could just ask, what would you say is the biggest example of how this caused a crisis? You mentioned the booms and busts of the last 3 decades. We've seen the savings and loan crisis, we've seen the housing bubble, and now critics say that this was a seminal moment, going off of the gold standard entirely, in the creation of the global debt crisis that we see today, confronting the U.S., confronting the world. How so? How do you connect Nixon's decision back then to the debt crisis we face today?
Well, the central bank was founded at the behest of big bankers, no one will be surprised to learn, back in the days of the Taft and the Wilson administrations at the beginning of the last century. And gradually it's been unleashed. So we can think of the central bank representing the big banks and representing Wall Street as having a leash around its neck. Nixon cut the final leash. The thing was, then the Federal Reserve was unleashed. And the more that it prints, the more that it lowers, I'm not going to get technical here, but the more that it lowers interest rates artificially, it causes recessions and depressions. We're in a depression right now. The whole Western world, in fact, is in a depression.
So then is the solution...
That's Nixon. It's the Nixon depression.
The Nixon depression. Is the solution to the depression you're talking about that you believe is going on and the economic woes facing this country a return to sound money and to the gold standard?
We certainly need to return to sound money. We do need a gold standard, I would say a free market gold standard, because if there's one thing every American, in fact everybody in the world ought to know, you can't trust the government. In fact, I would say nobody could be trusted with the power to just print up unlimited numbers of new $100 bills in your basement and spend them on what you want. Nobody can be trusted with that, and certainly politicians can't be trusted. So a government gold standard is not the answer. Ron Paul, I think, very correctly suggests as a baby step towards a sound money system, allowing competitive currencies, allow other things besides the dollar to be used legally and from a tax standpoint to have the same status as the dollar. That would be a huge step forward. That's the kind of thing we need to do. And I think there's no question that gold would outcompete everything else as money, just as it has for thousands and thousands of years.
And over those thousands and thousands of years, we saw currencies were tied to precious metals. They were tied to things like gold. Now with a fiat currency, that's based on faith. That's based on the performance of politicians and central bankers who you say people can't trust. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the U.S.'s credit rating downgraded because politicians failed to rein in debt, and it was largely a political assessment of how effective politicians are at doing their jobs. We've seen analysts say that the central bank is out of tools, that the Federal Reserve has either done too much quantitative easing or not enough quantitative easing. How big of a threat are the current leaders to the U.S. dollar right now and its value as a fiat currency?
Well, let's understand, first of all, these people do not want to restrain debt. They do not want to restrain spending. Both parties are dedicated to it. Both parties follow the economics of John Maynard Keynes. They believe in spending. They believe in debt. You know, on alternative days, they refer to the debt as a stimulus. So this is just government as usual, Keynesian government as usual. They do not want to, and I'm very glad that the Standard & Poor's did that. Not because the U.S. will default. They're going to print up all the paper dollars they need to pay everybody off. But the question is, of course, what will the dollar be worth? The dollar, as your great chart pointed out, has been plummeting in value. It's going to continue to plummet in value. And what the Federal Reserve is doing by holding interest rates near zero, which the crazy Keynes had advocated back in 1936, is not only wrecking savers and investors, but it's wrecking the future of the economy. Everything they're doing is a negative. And by the way, the Republicans are every bit as much responsible for this. Nixon, of course, was a Republican, as the Democrats are. So both parties are in cahoots with Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and Citibank and Bank of America, those sorts of institutions against the American people, and I would say against the people of the world. So we need a radical change, and thank goodness Ron Paul is talking about this.
Well, speaking of a radical change and a return to sound money, would that even be possible at this point? Or as legendary gold trader Jim Sinclair said, is that impossible? It would open Pandora's box of derivatives that are still floating around the entire globe and reveal the lack of balance sheet integrity in the U.S. banking system, where you can value your assets at whatever you think they're worth.
Well, it would reveal, of course, absolutely the bankruptcy of many financial institutions. But in order to get out of a depression, once the Federal Reserve has brought on a recession or a depression, the only way to get out of it is to liquidate the bad investments, not have the government tax regular people to bail out the toxic assets of the big banks. We have to have bankruptcies. Once we have bankruptcies and we have the return of reality, then we can rebuild. But as long as we have this phony baloney system punishing the average person for the rich guys connected to the government, we're going to have more and more trouble. So we have to have bankruptcies, massive bankruptcies. That will be the beginning of the healing and the beginning of a return to growth and prosperity. But
how much pain would that cause also the average person in the short run? You know, honestly, there will be pain in the short run with that solution, right?
Of course there's pain. You know, it's a little bit like the alcoholic goes into the doctor and the doctor says, I want you to stop drinking. And the guy says, well, that's, going to give me a lot of pain. Well, that's right, but to get on the path to health, you have to stop the drinking. So we have to stop the money printing. We have to allow the big banks to go out of business if that's what's going to happen. And my guess is they would go out of business because these fractional reserve banks are bankrupt anyway, and especially these days, as you note, they have so many phony assets. They, the Accounting Board of Standards was prevented from putting correct accounting standards into place so that the banks could continue to lie about what the worth of their so-called assets is. This needs to be cleaned up. Again, we need realism, no more phony opium dreams out of the Federal Reserve.